are going to talk about bail reform. And Insha Rahman will talk about bail reform, what it actually means, what is considered successful bail reform, what's motivating it, and she's going to talk about what's happened when jurisdictions have tried to change the bail system. Insha is the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at the Vera Institute of Justice, which if all of you, many of you are criminal justice reporters, you're all probably very familiar with Vera. She has a focus on prosecutorial reform, bail, de-incarceration, and she develops advocacy-related strategies and accountability on that. Before being at Vera, she was a public defender at the Bronx Defenders. She's also been on the staff of the Independent Commission on the New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform Commission. She earned her law degree at City University of New York School of Law and her undergrad in Africana Studies from Vassar College. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and we have her until 6 o'clock. She's going to present and then take questions. So, Insha.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris. And thank you all. It's great to be here and really wonderful to get to talk with you about bail and pretrial justice, which is an issue close to my heart. As Chris said, I got my start in criminal justice reform about 20 years ago. I actually did work behind bars in prisons and then went to law school, became a public defender. And so I know the use of bail and the practice of bail sort of inside and out from watching bail get set day in and day out as 6 years as a public defender. For the past 6 years, I've been at Vera leading a number of different areas of work, including work to push on advocacy and policy around criminal justice more broadly, but especially on bail reform. And so I'll be speaking for 45 minutes. If you have questions or if you want to go back to a particular slide, just write it down. And I really hope for this to be a conversation. So I'm looking forward to your questions, looking forward to getting to talk more. I know some of you, I certainly know a lot of your work, and excited to dig in. And I will just say this, is I'll be focusing on bail and pretrial justice, but a lot of what I will say about the use of data, the politicization of criminal justice reporting and covering, that's not just specific to bail and pretrial justice, it's an issue that's been front and center in the country because there has been momentum on bail reform in many parts of the country, both blue, red, purple, and everything in between. But a lot of what I'll have to say about pretrial justice and using a case study in New York, it's really, I think, lessons learned for the field and criminal justice reporting overall. And so just a few words about the Vera Institute of Justice. I lead advocacy and partnerships there, and for those of you who don't know, and I feel like you all do know the Vera Institute, we've been around since 1961. We are one of the largest and oldest criminal justice organizations in the country. In our 60 years, we work across the criminal legal system, from policing, prosecution, bail, to conditions behind bars and reentry, budget justice and reinvestment, and how that intersects with criminal legal and immigration system reform. We're a place that's known for our research and our data. So if you are investigating an issue and you're curious, are there some statistics about a particular issue? Are there reports on best practices? Give our website a look, and also feel free to reach out to me or folks on staff. We're 300 people strong as an organization, work across the country. And beyond research and good data are also folks who sort of do criminal justice reform. So our specialty is that we work with government partners to help build the institutions that actually deliver public safety, and dismantle the institutions that harm us, that perpetuate racism in the criminal legal system, that perpetuate harm, that actually don't keep us safe. Now, what I'm going to focus on is bail and pretrial justice, and do a case study of New York, which passed bail reform back in 2019. I'm going to start, though, with just an overview of some of the fundamentals of bail and pretrial for you to know, just as, how does bail work? What are the fundamental concepts and precepts that drive it? What do you need to know about sort of bail practice as you are reporting on this particular issue? And then I'm going to turn to New York, which is an issue really dear to my heart because I actually helped to draft the legislation that got passed in 2019 and was one of the advocates who worked to defend the law in 2020 when it faced backlash And even today, we're still continuing to face backlash. And so I hope that you ask questions about the reporting itself, the politics of it, and know that I'm certainly coming from a perspective. I'm very much an advocate on this. But I think I'll say this, and I think many of you will agree, there's no such thing as neutral or impartial reporting or politics when it comes to criminal justice, including on bail. And then I want to end my presentation piece with a few tips that I think are helpful for reporters as you are covering bail and pretrial reform that, again, I hope are helpful sort of across the board, since all of you cover much more than just the front end of the system in bail and pretrial. Two quick things to keep in mind before we dig into the fundamentals of bail and pretrial justice. The first is that bail practices are really local and specific, and they're essentially governed by two things. One is state law. Each state has a different set of laws and rules and policies and practices around bail. Some states don't really use money bail, like New Jersey, New York to a large degree. Here in Illinois, starting in 2023, there will be no more use of cash bail. Many states allow for what's called commercial bail, which is essentially the bail bond industry. Historically, only 4 states have actually banned the use of commercial bail, Illinois being one of them. And the other piece is that beyond state law, courtroom custom and practices dictate what happens when it comes to bail decisions day in and day out. I'm assuming many of you have sat in court and you've watched, like if you are in one judge's courtroom with one district attorney, you'll see certain bail practices, another judge, another courtroom, the practice looks different. So both understanding the larger policy and framework that governs bail in a particular state, and then recognizing so much of what happens with bail is specific to the district attorney's office and to the judge and to the courtroom you're in. The second thing to keep in mind, and this again comes from my perspective, which is all bail reform is not equal. We have seen in recent years that as much as there has been momentum for bail and pretrial justice, I would say it's the area of criminal justice reform that has perhaps seen the most wins in terms of decarceration, fewer people behind bars, reform that I consider good. A lot of what we're seeing get tagged as bail reform and getting pushed is in fact not leading to good changes, but is regressive. An example of that is Texas, where Texas just passed a law that was framed as bail reform, but in fact the result will be over 17,000 more people booked into jails annually because of the change in law. And so I want to lay out what, in my view, is a good standard for whether something is or is not good bail reform. First of all, it eliminates wealth and profit as the basis for pretrial release and detention. So taking money and profit out of the equation, that's got to happen in order for something to be considered good bail reform. The second is that it needs to decarcerate, meaning there need to be fewer people behind bars as a result. And the reason bail and pretrial justice is so important is the front end of the system, how people end up in jail and likely in prison, is because bail has been set that they can't afford. And so if bail reform takes money or profit out of the equation but doesn't result in fewer people behind bars, and there's a number of examples of when that's happened, then it's not actually good bail reform. The third is that it needs to address racial disparities, and I have a slide later that shows just how bad the racial disparities are when it comes to bail setting and who is incarcerated pretrial. And then fourth, importantly, good bail reform should protect public safety. And here's what I'll say about that, because that's often the bugaboo that really gets politicized around bail reform and having fewer people behind bars is, will this compromise public safety? Every single study that we have seen of bail and pretrial justice that has been good bail reform has found that public safety is protected, in fact even enhanced, because we are using bail and pretrial incarceration less. So just a few examples of where what has been known as bail reform hasn't worked out according to those 4 sort of standards or principles. New Mexico and Maryland, those are those 2 headlines, as you can see. New Mexico passed bail reform that largely eliminated the use of money bail back in 2017. Maryland did the same through court rules and changes. And what you saw is New Mexico eliminated cash bail, but now one county, Bernalillo County, locks up more people without bond before trial. So money is being taken out of the equation, but to the point that there's got to be fewer people behind bars. Bernalillo County shows us that the way that New Mexico did bail reform means money's out of the equation, but there's actually more people detained in the local jail. And likewise with Maryland, same story, eliminated the use of money bail to a large degree, but they found that pretrial preventative detention, meaning people are incarcerated without any bail amount set, they're just locked up pretrial, that increased as a result of bail reform. And then even places that have done bail well, like New Jersey, which passed bail reform in 2014, it went into effect in 2017, and over 5 years of New Jersey's bail reform being in effect, the jail population has declined by 45%. It's pretty remarkable. Mind you, going to public safety, overall crime has been reduced by almost 1/3 in that same period of time, and violent crime is down in New Jersey until this funny blip that we've had with the pandemic. Violent crime has been down 18% in the same time that bail reform went into effect. So those are important statistics to know in terms of decarceration and public safety. But here's the catch with New Jersey's bail reform, is that a report came out last year that found even though the jail population has almost shrunk by 1/2, racial disparities remain the same. The jail population in New Jersey before bail reform was 54% black. Today it's 55% black. So again, good bail reform needs to address racial disparities in addition to taking money and profit out of the equation and reducing the number of people behind bars. And Ted, I'll give you a shout out that the Crime Report and Criminal Justice News, I think that's another outlet that you're involved with, and it's certainly a place that I go to for good criminal justice reporting. And then just one more example of bail reform that it looks like it could be good, but actually isn't, is in California, which in 2018 passed what's known as Senate Bill 10, which eliminated money bail entirely and would be the first state to do so had it gone into effect. But progressive organizations like the ACLU actually opposed bail reform there because SB 10, if it had gone into effect, would have actually resulted in just as many people, if not more people, behind bars, even though money bail was taken out because of the use of risk assessment instruments and preventative detention being expanded in the law. So again, those are just some concrete examples. Some of them are from places where you do reporting. I'm sure you know them well. Just to point out that all bail reform is not good bail reform. Now, an overview of bail and pretrial fundamentals. And again, the reason that bail is so important, it really is the front end of the system in terms of people experiencing incarceration and likely prison. So for one thing, bail, when people say bail, they're often thinking cash bail, a dollar amount, $5,000, $10,000, $25,000, right? But bail, historically and in the law, is actually the right to release pretrial. The US Supreme Court, in a very famous pretrial justice case, Stack versus Boyle in 1951, defined bail as pretrial release. And that's important because that's what we are aiming for as we look into bail reform. It's not about money, it's really about the decision to release or detain pretrial and the due process protections that come with it. Now, the two reasons now that judges can set bail or detain somebody pretrial are, first of all, to compel appearance in court, and the second is for public safety. And those are two important precepts to sort of pull apart and look into, because for one thing, the idea of failure to appear was really behind the use and the increasing use of money bail. Until the turn of the 19th century in this country, bail was used to basically be an IOU. If you don't come back to court, then you or your family or your community is on the hook for a certain amount of money, but we're pretty sure you'll come back because we know you, we know where you live. As sort of the Great Migration happened, people moved west. We saw the rise of the bail bond industry, and we saw the use increasingly of money bail. So not only was it an IOU, but it was, and you need to put down $50, $500 in order to secure release. The idea being that if you have a financial incentive or a hook you will come back to court because you don't want to lose that money. You don't want your family to lose that money. So that's the idea around compelling court appearance by setting a monetary amount. The second piece, though, is public safety. And in 1987, the US Supreme Court in Salerno upheld the federal bail reform law of 1984, where for the first time it became the law of the land that judges can set money bail, not only to compel people to come to court, but to protect public safety. And that's actually quite controversial, because somebody who's arrested is pretrial, they're presumed innocent. We don't have a crystal ball to know, is this person dangerous or not? Will this person be arrested, commit a new crime while out pretrial? Yet Salerno essentially gave judges the power to say, even without that crystal ball, if I have a feeling that this person might compromise public safety, I can set bail to either detain them or to compel some, again, monetary amount to be caught up as sort of collateral in the case to, quote unquote, keep the public safe. Now, here's the problem, though, is we have seen so many studies come out on bail reform and pretrial practices. And what we've found is that money bail has no correlation with public safety. And if you think it through, of course, that makes sense. Just because somebody is wealthy and can afford the amount of their freedom doesn't mean that they are more safe in the community, less likely to commit a new crime. There's been no study that has found a correlation between wealth and whether somebody is more likely to engage in criminal behavior. And then second, and this is the one that I think surprises people, is most of us think, well, sure, if I have a financial incentive to show up, then I'm not going to not come, I'm gonna come. If I don't have a financial incentive, I might be more likely to miss court. Again, study after study has compared how do people who are released pretrial because they paid money bail compared to people who are released pretrial who didn't put down any money, how do they fare? Turns out they show up to court at the same rate. And I will say this as a former public defender, as somebody who's represented thousands of people, I knew when my clients were going to show up to court because it was my clients who felt this is serious, this is important, this has an impact on my life or on my family, on my livelihood. That was what incentivized people to show up to court, not necessarily because I put $500 or $1,000 down. Certainly that matters too, but not to any greater extent than the seriousness of facing a criminal legal charge. And again, the places to look to point out that is New Jersey, which has largely eliminated money bail. Court appearance rates before bail reform were about 87% of people showed up to court. Today, it's closer to 90%. Likewise, New York City has for many years now not really used money bail, but it does to some degree, so there's actually a real life sort of comparison group to compare, and then people right now who are released having paid money bail show up to court 90% of the time. People who are released under supervised release, which is New York City's version of pretrial supervision, come back to court 92% of the time. So we have great data that shows money is actually not needed to compel court appearance or get people to return to court. And so money bail has tremendous impacts when it comes to race and racial disparities. This is a chart from the Prison Policy Initiative that essentially shows the percentage of people incarcerated in local jails compared to the overall population. And you will see that white people make up 47% of the jail population versus 62% of the overall US population. Black people, however, are only 13% of the US population, but make up fully over 1/3 of the jail population. People who are Latinx or Hispanic, it's about 17% of the overall population, about 15% of the jail population. And when you look at the numbers and the breakdowns in this country about generational wealth, it makes total sense that Black people are disproportionately represented in local jails as a result of bail policy. What we know is that when judges are facing two defendants, two individuals who have the same charges, are similarly situated, bail is more likely to be set on the Black individual than the white individual. Study after study has shown that. Study after study has also shown that when bail is set, bail is set higher on Black individuals than on white individuals. And what we also know is generational wealth and poverty in this country falls along racial lines, where Black families are historically far less wealthy than white families. And what we also know from the Federal Reserve is that over 40% of Americans would struggle to cover a $400 emergency expense. The average bail amount on felony cases in this country is $10,000. Even if you were to go to a bail bondsman where you put down only 10% of the full amount, that's still $1,000, which 40% of Americans and American families don't have that kind of money to cover the costs. So that explains why money bail drives both jail populations as well as specifically the racial disparities that we see in pretrial incarceration. The reason I care so deeply about bail and pretrial justice is because, as I keep saying, it really is the front end of the system for people who are arrested. We know that there are significant life outcomes as a result of pretrial incarceration, as well as case outcomes. And here's what we know about the life outcomes, is even as little as 2 days in jail can be so destabilizing to somebody that research has shown that they're more likely to be arrested in the future because they have lost their employment, their housing, stability, family connections, just as a result of being incarcerated. And so, the takeaway from that is when we put somebody in jail, we are basically saying we are going to do this despite the research that tells us that this is actually less good, not more good, for public safety. Likewise, in terms of legal outcomes, case outcomes, somebody who's detained pre-trial compared to somebody with the exact same charges, similarly situated, who is released, the person who's detained is 18% more likely to be convicted, as well as 18% more likely to receive a jail or prison sentence than somebody who's released. So just the fact of being incarcerated pre-trial, having bail set that you can't make, basically guarantees that your case, your legal outcomes will be worse. And I'll go ahead and share this PowerPoint with you all after, because as you can see, there's sources at the bottom, so you can look and see the research that I'm quoting. Now, that's the sort of background that I think is helpful. What's the basis for setting bail? What do we know about the impacts and the effect of bail when it is set? And what do we know about a couple of different jurisdictions that have done quote unquote bail reform, and whether it's been good or not based on those 4 precepts that I hold dear in terms of what looks like good and bad bail reform. But what I want to go to now is a case study, because this is where I think it gets really interesting and where the role of the media and reporting is so key. So in 2019, New York passed bail reform. And this was a long-fought and hard-won victory where essentially bail is no longer used for the vast majority of arrests, the vast majority of cases that come through the courts. It got extensive media coverage. I know some of you are based in the New York area. You cover New York criminal justice. And I'm sure you're nodding your heads that, yep, this was the issue that sort of took over the headlines from 2019 when the law was passed to 2020 when it went into effect, to mid-2020 when there were some rollbacks, and even today because it's looming large in the elections that just happened last Tuesday. So let's take it apart. What actually happened in New York's bail reform? Well, this is a headline from NPR. It's a really interesting, quick little synopsis of the bail law, and I think that this, the byline is really telling. So New York's criminal justice overhaul takes effect Wednesday, January 1st, 2020, limiting cash bail and forcing district attorneys to share evidence earlier. Police and prosecutors worry that the system will favor defendants. So hold on to that. Police and prosecutors are worried about this and the impact it will actually have on people going through the criminal legal system. So what did New York's bail reform law actually do? Essentially had 5 ways in which it was distinct from other versions of bail reform that had passed. Washington, D.C. passed bail reform in the early 1990s. New Jersey passed bail reform, as I mentioned, in 2017. But there were 5 areas of New York's bail reform law that is really distinct that I want to talk about. First, the law required mandatory appearance tickets, basically summonses or tickets for the vast majority of offenses, misdemeanors, and low-level felonies. So instead of people being brought to court and seeing a judge right after being arrested, they would in fact be given a ticket and come back to court. Every other bail law essentially did some version of that, like New Jersey or DC, but for a much narrower swath of cases and at the discretion of law enforcement, the arresting officer. New York mandated that, which basically meant thousands and thousands of New Yorkers are no longer, after arrest, going through the court, spending 24 hours or longer waiting to see a judge. They're simply going home within hours after an arrest and expected to come back to court at a later date. The second thing that New York's bail law did was mandatory release on a wide swath of cases. And this is important because, again, until New York passed this law in 2019, the expectation, the custom of bail reform was to say a strong presumption of release, but judges retain discretion to still be able to set bail or detain somebody even on low-level charges. New York's bail law basically said, we know what prosecutors and judges are doing with discretion when you give it to them, which is using it to incarcerate. We're simply going to take the ability to detain off the table for the vast majority of misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies, and discretion will still lie with judges around the conditions of release, but not to detain. That was a huge and very controversial piece of New York's law. The third is parsimony in the conditions of release. So when judges release people, what we saw in New Jersey is that they were inclined to put people on electronic monitoring, on drug testing, on conditions that are onerous that we know often set people up to fail. They might still be coming back to court. They might still have no arrest during the pretrial period, but they might have a problem with their ankle monitor, or they might fail a drug test, and for that reason are considered to have failed pretrial release, the conditions of pretrial release. In New York, the law basically said if conditions are imposed, they have to be revisited. Electronic monitoring can't be imposed except for on a limited set of cases that are more serious and have to be looked at every 60 days to say, is this electronic monitor still necessary? So somebody doesn't remain on an ankle monitor for, say, a year or 18 months during the whole pendency of their case. Again, really different than what we had seen any other bail law do before 2019. The other two important pieces were the role of risk assessment instruments, which I'm not going to cover in depth because it's a whole other talk. But if folks have questions about risk assessment instruments and pretrial, happy to answer them. But essentially, New York said, you don't have to use a risk assessment tool. We're not going to do what New Jersey did, which mandates risk assessments. And we're also going to make sure that when risk assessments are used, if a county elects to do so, that they will be used in a way that makes them more transparent, that makes the data from it available so that you can actually study them and see, are there racial disparities that are perpetuated as a result of using the risk assessment tool. And then the fifth innovation in New York's bail law was if for the limited number of cases, and so about 90% of cases no longer you could set bail, people are just released, for the 10% of cases which are the violent felony offenses, the serious domestic violence cases, if judges are going to set bail on those cases, they must consider the person's ability to pay and set a couple of forms of bail, which essentially would end the bail bond industry, because if you set what's called a partially secured bond, where you put 10% of the bail amount down with the court and you get that back at the end of your case, you're no longer going to go to the bail bondsman. You're going to just give that money, that 10% to the court, as opposed to giving it to a bail bondsman where when you put that money down, you don't get it back at the end of the case. So that's a very quick run through. There's a lot more in New York's bail law, but those are, I would say, the highlights that caused the most controversy. And the backlash to the law when it went into effect in January 2020 was swift. In fact, the backlash started even before the law went into effect, when it was passed in April 2019. And so here's what we saw. Literally, this is a headline from right before bail reform formally went into effect, from December 2019. And this woman is Ms. Tiffany Harris, and she was arrested and accused of assaulting 3 Hasidic women on the street, and she was released because those were misdemeanor assault charges where bail is no longer available. Judges can't actually set bail on that case. She was arrested again a couple of days later, again for a low-level assault, again targeting a Hasidic woman on the street. And again, she was released because that's what the new law says. Now, mind you, Ms. Harris had severe mental health issues, which were well documented. She didn't have any money. She clearly had a lot of instability beyond her mental health needs, but in terms of housing. There's a lot else going on, but this was the headline, that she's dangerous, that bail reform is dangerous, and it's harming our communities. And so this is just one example of literally dozens of cases that got picked by the courts and by judges and by prosecutors and law enforcement and sort of run across the headlines. And what we saw is literally within 3 weeks into January that bail reforms, where's that slide? I'm sorry. I can't find it. So I had a slide in here that I somehow missed, but basically there's a public opinion poll that came out by Siena College 3 weeks after the new law went into effect in January that found that support for bail reform overall had tanked from 57% of New Yorkers supporting bail reform in April 2019 when the law was first passed to less than 30% of New Yorkers supporting it 3 weeks into its implementation in January 2020. Now, all of you know, because I'm sure you look at polls and public sentiment, that's a tremendous shift across every demographic, Republican, Independent, Democrat. And it was basically clearly generated by the headlines that were, bail reform is making our communities less safe. And for politicians in New York, that was the signal that we can't actually keep our majority. We can't actually, stay in power if we have this much backlash to a reform that we put into place that actually had widespread support just 9 months ago when we first moved in that direction and championed bail reform. And so what we saw in April 2020, so not even 4 months after the law went into effect, there were some rollbacks that the Senate and the Assembly in New York passed, and those went into effect in July 2020. And so what this chart shows is what was the actual impact of bail reform in New York before it was to some degree rolled back. Well, first of all, the impact was that it not only limited the use of money bail, but it actually resulted in significant decarceration. So the jail population back in April 2019, when the law was first passed, but before it was implemented, was about 20,500. What we saw is when counties across the state started to say, okay, we're going to implement bail reform early. In October 2019, the jail population dropped a little bit to 19,500. And then as soon as bail reform went into effect, January 2020, the jail population dropped to about 15,000 and continued to drop, especially with the onset of COVID, until in July 2020, the jail population was about 11,000 people statewide. So we had literally gone from 20,000 to 11,000, an over 45% decrease in the jail population, literally within a year as a result of bail reform. So we know bail reform definitely limited the use of money bail and for-profit in the pretrial system. We also know it definitely decarcerated. What we also know, though, and what the headlines tell us, is that bail reform was working in terms of public safety. Yes, there were absolutely, in New York and in every other place in this country, there was an uptick in violence, in shootings and homicides during that period of 2020 and 2021. You're going to hear from some of the best criminologists later on in this program who will give you some explanations for why. And I would say the one-sentence punchline is, it's the pandemic, stupid. It really is. And every single study that actually looked to see what was the impact of bail reform on, say, gun violence or homicides, which were the two crimes that were spiking in New York City at the time, found there was no correlation. And so there's a great piece that the Center for Court Innovation put out on the facts of bail reform and crime in New York City that has good data about what impact did bail reform actually have on public safety. And the truth is, it was just fine. It didn't harm public safety. The New York Post put out a piece in July 2020 where they pulled 6 months of data for about the 11,000 people who were released from the courts as a result of bail reform and COVID releases. And they found that less than 1% of people who were released in that cohort were involved in anything to do with a shooting or gun violence, either as a defendant, a perpetrator, or as a victim or a witness. And so what we saw just recently is NYPD Commissioner Shea, the police commissioner in New York City, who'd been claiming since bail reform first was adopted and then when it went into effect, is that bail reform is compromising public safety. Turns out he was fact-checked at a hearing just a couple of weeks ago and they were like, show me the data. Tell me what these numbers are. And he was like, okay, actually, maybe bail reform isn't the driver for the gun violence that is really real. The uptick in shootings and homicides is real, but bail reform isn't the culprit, but it got used as such. And that's where we have to be really careful about who is the messenger, what are they claiming, and what are the facts and the evidence behind why. And so my organization, Vera, we worked on passing the bail law back in 2019. We worked on implementation. We literally worked with judges across the state and prosecutors across the state to get them ready for the law and implementation. And then we worked with the legislature and with the political forces that be to protect the law against backlash and rollbacks in 2020. And we will go back and do it again this upcoming legislative session where we know bail reform is again being blamed for things like 2 Democratic DAs losing their elections in Long Island, which has historically turned from a red to a blue district in recent years. But we saw a real backlash again, and bail reform was the headlines there. And what I want to say about this is a clear example of where politics is driving what is happening in our communities, not facts or evidence. Again, every time we've looked at the facts and the data and the evidence around bail reform in New York, we have seen that it doesn't compromise public safety. I named the statistics from New Jersey that's now in year 5 of bail reform, and again, hasn't compromised public safety, and actually the uproar around bail reform there, which certainly got backlash, has died down significantly. But it continues in New York, and it's really because of the politicization of the issue of bail reform and criminal justice reform by prosecutors, by police commissioners like Commissioner Shea, that are peddling, frankly, misinformation and falsehoods about the bail law and what it actually does and doesn't do. And so I will end by offering a few tips for how to holistically report on bail and pretrial reform, given what we saw in New York and given the power of the media and headlines to undermine good common sense policy that resulted in the use of money and profit in the pretrial system, far less, that actually decarcerated, fewer people are behind bars. Still hasn't done a great job on racial disparities, and I can talk more about that, and we've got some more work to do on that front. And then it certainly, bail reform in New York did not compromise public safety, yet it got blamed for doing so. And so how do we avoid in the future these kind of debacles? Because for those of us in the criminal justice field, the story about New York isn't a local story. I work on bail reform across the country. I was just working in Austin, Texas in the legislature this past session on a bail law. I've been here in Illinois a lot on a bail law, in California, Ohio. And everywhere I hear is, we don't want the bail reform that happened in New York because that was a mess. That was bad for public safety, even though that isn't true. So local issues, state level, local issues, they carry. And one of the things we've seen is that the bail bond industry, which works nationally, even though it seems like mom and pop stores, they're actually a very organized force. They've been taking this message that New York and bail reform is a mess, don't do it, and going and talking to state houses in Ohio, in Texas, elsewhere to say, you don't want to do this because it will compromise public safety, even when that isn't the truth. So here's a couple of tips. And then after that, I'll open it up for you all to chime in with thoughts, comments, reflections. So first of all, if the headlines in New York had been about the overall results, 11,000 people are released as a result of bail reform. Less than 1% are involved as a defendant, victim, or witness in a gun crime. That's a very different headline than Tiffany Harris keeps getting released and then assaults yet another Hasidic woman. Bail reform is bad for the safety of our communities, right? They tell two really different stories. And so I urge you all to look at the facts and the statistics about bail and pretrial overall, and not just at the individual outlier cases. They might make for better clickbait, but they don't actually tell an accurate and true story of the impact of a particular criminal legal reform. The second is, you saw the picture of Ms. Tiffany Harris, and she looked disheveled, she didn't look well. They kept putting that picture up everywhere. And it was dehumanizing. It made people feel afraid. It was really a dog whistle, and a racist one, I would say. And we saw that again and again with a couple of cases where somebody was released because of the bail law, went out and got arrested, and of course the coverage was degrading, dehumanizing, would put their criminal history, their past arrests up there, and that's what they led with. Not anything sympathetic or humanizing, not how you or I would want to be portrayed. And so, to the extent that individual stories are what you focus on, and they are part and parcel of journalism and media coverage, be humanizing in the portrayal of people. Dig in to say, what was behind this? Who is this person? Not just what is their criminal history. And make sure you talk to their families, people who work with them, their communities, their churches, not just to the district attorney and the police in terms of understanding this person and who they are and the charges in front of you. Third, we know that reporters went to Police Commissioner Shea, to other DAs, to law enforcement sources to report about bail reform. I urge reporters, and I've said this to every reporter I've talked to in New York, and I'll say it to all of you, consult practitioners, researchers, and advocates in addition to your law enforcement sources. It is just an easy, simple, clear way of balancing out and getting a full perspective on a particular case, a particular policy, a particular reform. And then fourth, when you see opponents of bail reform, and Commissioner Shea would say, I definitely don't support this bail law. Many of the DAs in New York said, I don't support this bail law. When they claim that it is undermining court appearance rates and public safety, ask for data, ask for evidence. Why are you saying that? What are the numbers? Where is that coming from? And the dirty truth about data, especially when it comes to the front end of the system about court practices, bail, and pretrial, is that the reporting and the collecting of that data is shoddy at best. Most communities don't have it. We have pretty decent data on jails. We have pretty decent data on prisons. We do not have good data on court practices, on what judges are doing, on how often bail is set, how often people are released or they make bail. So ask for that data before you write and document claims that bail reform has undermined public safety. And so I obviously say this coming from a place of, you can feel, I think, my heartbreak at sort of how this story has played out in New York, not just for New York, but really for what it means for the rest of the country. Bail as an issue was one that when I got into this business 20 years ago, it's one that resonates with people, that money shouldn't determine your freedom. It doesn't make sense that whether you are wealthy or poor determines whether you go free pre-trial. But the challenge about bail reform is that it's not just about money, it's really about how do we invest in using incarceration jails and prisons less, and investing in public safety in our communities, which is keeping people home with their families, in their jobs, providing stability, making sure people come back to court, and allowing for accountability to look like something other than incarceration. So thank you so much, really glad for the opportunity to talk to you, and I'll open it up for questions.
We have plenty of time for questions. Raise your hands and we will, we'll start back with Emily, right?
Thank you so much for this, by the way, it's very helpful. So I've heard DAs repeating a line that bail reform and pandemic-related emergency measures on how many people they're keeping in jails has created this sort of revolving door in local jails where they're seeing the same people every week, particularly for members of local unsheltered communities. So have you heard this? What do you think about that? And also, how would you suggest local reporters verify that?
Yep.
With data can we request?
Yeah. So when I've heard prosecutors and judges say that, well, I keep seeing the same people come through again and again, they're usually thinking about a handful of people that they have seen before bail reform or before pandemic-related measures to release people. And they're thinking about those people because they do, in fact, keep cycling through the system. Like, that's real. I mean, what we have seen in this country is that there are over 10 million bookings to jail each year. Of those 10 million bookings, there's only about 6 million individuals. So there's a lot of people who keep coming through the system and keep ending up in jail. My recommendation as a reporter for how to cover that issue is, first of all, to ask, well, how many actual individuals are we talking about when we're talking about the revolving door? Show me the data in terms of court cases and arrests. And then the second part is to look and say, well, if this person has been incarcerated this many times before and it isn't actually addressing the issue, which is often driven by instability, housing instability, instability around mental health and medical care, instability around just sheer poverty, well, then one more stint in jail is not going to make a difference. And so the other piece that I encourage people to look at is, well, instead of jail, which is the most expensive criminal justice resource a county has, how much is the county spending on pretrial services? How much is the county spending on housing and shelter for people who are justice system involved? Right now, we have a tremendous influx of federal money coming to our communities. Most counties and communities in this country actually have a windfall this upcoming year because of the American Rescue Plan Act dollars and dollars that will come through the infrastructure bill that was just passed, will be signed tomorrow. Ask, well, how are you allocating that money for recovery of our communities, which is what the American Rescue Plan Act is about. And one of the legitimate uses of ARPA dollars is to build housing and shelter for folks, including justice system involved folks, and to invest in things like mental health, medical health care, as well as mobile crisis response teams, which are an alternative to police and law enforcement, to say if somebody is having a mental health episode, have the mobile crisis response team, not law enforcement, come. That is when we know there's going to be a different result, not just the person is arrested, comes in front of the judge, bail gets set, they're incarcerated for a short stint, and then rinse and repeat. So that's how I recommend approaching that issue, to really sort of flip the frame, ask for data, and then ask for the actual investments that will stop that cycle, since incarceration clearly fails to do so.
Okay, so we'll go to, it's Philip, right? We'll go to Philip, and then Kaylee, and then Sam. So Philip.
Okay, yeah. Hi, thank you. So yeah, I wanted to ask, because you did talk a lot about homicides and things like that, and how it relates. And so that was kind of like a big topic in Baltimore, for example. And I wanted to see, because you kind of looked at New York and what happened there in analysis, but I do want to know, like in a city like Baltimore or even Chicago here, how does, as far as pretrial detainees and, district attorneys not pursuing low-level crimes, low-level offenses and things like that, to lower the jail population, because that was a big conversation with COVID-19 last year and to prevent spread. How can cities like Chicago and Baltimore, who have people on the ground who drive these kind of like harsh narratives and fear of crime and certain things like that, kind of move forward after this pandemic, and we see these results that bail reform doesn't really have that direct correlation?
Yeah. I think what we learned in this pandemic, which we've never actually had an opportunity to see before, is that across the country, in big cities, medium-sized cities, rural parts of the country, gun violence and homicides increased. Lubbock, Texas, which is not a place that did any kind of bail or criminal justice reform, actually saw one of the greatest increases in this country in shootings. Likewise, I can name a whole bunch of other places that have done no criminal justice reform, no bail reform, where we saw homicides and shootings rise much higher than they did in New York City, for example, or even here in Chicago, which got a lot of press the way Baltimore did as well, St. Louis did, around lawlessness and increased violence and less public safety in big Democratic-led cities. And so what the pandemic has shown us is this isn't about Democrat versus Republican. It's not about criminal justice reform or decarceration. It's about a pandemic that, for reasons that are really not totally known to us, there's something about the pandemic that drove instability and shootings and homicides across the country. And I know one of the people you'll be hearing from is Dr. Richard Rosenfeld, who I would say is the authority on crime trends during the pandemic, and he will say essentially what I just said because I'm quoting his research on this. And so what do we actually do on the ground when these harsh narratives take hold and they're really hard to shake? For one thing, as reporters, you have tremendous power and wield it so to actually report differently. The headline cannot be, murders soar in New York City, bail reform is responsible, Commissioner Shea says, right? That headline, for most people who are flipping through the news, that's all they need to know to say bail reform is responsible for what I'm seeing on the nightly news. If the headline instead is, across the country, homicides and shootings have spiked, the pandemic is the common factor, that's a very different narrative, right? And it opens the door to, at a local level, making different investments. The other thing is to flip the reporting to not be about criminal justice reform measures like COVID decarceration or bail, and to actually report on, and most communities, at least that I've worked with and been in, have some form, either formal or informal, of community violence intervention. And what we have seen is community violence intervention programs where it's members of the community, experts who have been trained up, who are often have involvement themselves in the criminal justice system. They certainly know communities. They know when shootings are about to happen. When shootings do happen, they often show up in hospitals, at people's houses to say, we know that when a shooting happens between either gangs or communities or people that know each other, there's retaliatory violence. To stop, to make sure that one shooting remains one and not 3 or 10 or 15, as we've often seen from the research about gun violence, that it has a sort of contagion effect. So that's how you flip the narrative, I would say, on what actually drives public safety. And you report on the pieces of public safety and the public safety narrative that go underreported, like community violence intervention, like ground-up solutions to make our communities safe. Because one of the really interesting pieces of research we did last year is we actually pulled from 72 of the biggest cities the police budgets, the number of police officers, the amount of overtime that they get, the pensions. How much are communities and counties spending on law enforcement? It turns out of the general budget, it's anywhere between 10 to upwards of 30, 35% in some communities. Literally, the budget is going towards the police. And what we saw in places that continue to put more and more money into police, public safety didn't increase as a result. There is no correlation between more police, more cops, more money for the police department, and more public safety. So that's another story that I think needs to be told, because money and our budgets reflect our moral values and our investments in what drives public safety. And we've seen time and time again places like New York and Massachusetts that have put more money into community violence intervention than other places. They've seen gun homicides, shootings decline by anywhere between 15 to 36%. We have not seen a similar return on investment from simply putting more cops on the street when violence goes up.
I'm at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in Fort Worth, Texas.
Yep.
So my question is in regards to a lot of the bail issues in Texas, especially currently. Do you have any specific recommendations for records and data that we can request that get at the disproportionate use of bail across racial lines?
Yep. And Kaylee, what you're referencing, for those of you who don't know, bail was a huge issue this past legislative session in Texas, and Governor Abbott actually called 3 special sessions after the regular legislative session ended to basically get bail done. And the law that got passed during the special session essentially prohibits judges from releasing people on certain kinds of charges and in certain circumstances, including really low-level offenses where I think most of us would wonder what's the issue with public safety. Here's the thing about Texas is there is terrible court data. I have spent years working in Harris County. I work on the bail settlement for a case called O'Donnell, which was a quite well-known lawsuit against the Harris County, Houston's bail system, and found it unconstitutional. Despite Houston being the largest jurisdiction in Texas, I believe 1/4 of all criminal cases in the state of Texas come through Harris County. There's terrible data on bail and race. The courts just don't keep it. And so what you're asking for doesn't exist. There are some ways to go around getting it scrappily, and one is that all counties have a jail management system and have what's called like an inmate locator where you can look up who's incarcerated. You can scrape that data, and they often do have race data, age, other sort of interesting, important sort of fields for you to gather. So it's very time consuming and labor intensive. There are a lot of researchers I know who are doing that kind of work, so we can connect after, I can point you to them, but it's not legit official data. Right now we know that the Speaker of the House in Texas is convening a set of working groups around bail, and so one of the things that we should be pushing, I'm hoping to push in Texas, is to actually collect better data on race, use of money bail, length of pretrial incarceration charges, but that just isn't readily available right now in Texas. And what I'm describing about the really terrible state of the data in Texas is true pretty much across the country. There are a handful of jurisdictions that collect excellent court and pretrial data. New York City, San Francisco, Chicago is not bad, but it's really a handful. I have to sort of start, racking my brains to think of the next jurisdictions. And so another thing that all of us need to do is call for and push for better data collection and dissemination so that we can all see, journalists, reform-minded folks like myself and average people, what's actually happening in our courts and in our jails.
Hi, my name's Sam. I am a reporter at Mother Jones Magazine in California. And I wanted to ask a question about California's bail reform, which you mentioned it failed partly because progressive groups like the ACLU were worried about the risk assessment program that it was going to do and how it might lead to more people getting locked up and worse racial disparities. And I think you had also mentioned that in New York, there is like a limited risk assessment program. So I've been kind of confused, like what is the difference? Like why is one bad and one good?
Yeah. Risk assessments are the most polarizing issue when it comes to bail and pretrial reform. I'm sure many of you are nodding like, yep. And the reason is that there's actually no real consensus on are they good, are they bad, what do they actually do? And part of the problem is it's not about the risk assessment and the recommendation that it makes, it's about what do judges or prosecutors do with that recommendation. And so there's been a lot of backlash in the field, especially by progressive organizations like the ACLU and others, the Pretrial Justice Institute, saying no risk assessments ever. And that's directly in response to places like New Jersey, that when New Jersey passed bail reform, they mandated the use of risk assessment so that people who are deemed low or medium risk are automatically released, and that there's actually a likelihood that folks who are deemed medium to high risk are detained. What we saw in New Jersey is that judges can override the risk assessment recommendation, and they were doing so 30% of the time. And you can be sure that that 30% of the time wasn't when somebody is deemed high risk, but they're releasing them anyway. It's when somebody's deemed medium or low risk, but they're being detained anyway. And the data in New Jersey showed that the racial disparities of which individuals were being detained despite being deemed low or medium risk, those were black and brown individuals. So that's where a lot of the controversy around risk assessment comes. California SB 10, which was passed in 2018, so a year after New Jersey's bail reform went into effect, it actually passed. The legislature passed it, Governor Brown signed it. And then the bail bond industry, because California is an odd state where everything goes to popular referendum, the bail bond industry got enough signatures to actually bring SB 10 to the public. So for a popular vote of whether or not it stays and goes on the books or fails. And what was so fascinating about that moment is you have the bail bond industry, which is fighting hard for their livelihood, because SB 10, if it went into effect, would end money bail. The bail bond industry, gone. California is their biggest market. It's literally $2 billion annually of bail bonds that they underwrite. And then, interestingly enough, along with the bail bond industry, the other opponents of SB 10 were left and progressive criminal justice, social justice, racial justice groups. Who said, well, implementing risk assessment instruments we've seen from DC, from New Jersey, will only have racially disparate effects. It won't actually help. And so that was the controversy. It was enough to sort of topple SB 10. It didn't pass. The voters in California voted no. And I would say, frankly, that was a good thing from my view, but I can think of many others who I respect a lot in the field who would disagree with me on that. And then taking that lesson, in New York, bail reform was passed in 2019. Many counties are already using risk assessment instruments. New York City does. So the question was, how do you allow counties to do what they're already doing but not mandate risk assessment? And how do you make sure that the use of risk assessment is more fair? And so here's what more fair use of risk assessment looks like. There's two sort of universes of risk assessment. There are the proprietary risk assessment tools, which are run by for-profit companies. The algorithm itself is a black box. You don't really know how you get the formula of whether somebody is low, medium, or high risk. You can't see the factors, you can't see the weighting. That was struck from New York's bail law to say any kind of risk assessment that is proprietary, that's a black box, cannot be used. Only risk assessments where you can see the individual factors. How many prior failures to appear does this person have? How many prior arrests or convictions do they have? Things like that. You could see them, you could see how they are weighted, and you could see how you actually got to medium or high or low risk. So that's one of the ways. And then the other was in New York, that any county that's using a risk assessment instrument has to make the risk assessment tool and the factors and weighting public. And they have to put out annual data on the risk assessment tool and sort of what are the racial implications of its use. Are different racial and ethnic groups being scored differently? And if so, then there needs to be some correction. So that's what a quote unquote good use of risk assessment looks like, to the extent that, again, there are people who are just hardliner, no risk assessments ever. They wouldn't think that that's enough, but for folks in the field who do use risk assessment instruments, that is sort of the gold standard of how to use them really carefully, so that you are in real time studying if there are racially disparate impacts as a result of the tool's use.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Cusack Smith. I'm a race and justice reporter for the USA Today network in New York. And bail reform, as you're saying, is a hot issue. Like, I can write about anything, and the comments will be because of bail reform, because of bail reform, because of bail reform. So, and it's something totally different. So with it, I find that it's very easy to tell, the very polarizing negative story, like Tiffany up on your presentation. But what we were struggling with in our newsroom is, how do you present the other side in a realistic way that's not just like, oh, the jail population went down, because then you'll have somebody comment, well, that's because you're releasing all of them out and the crime rate is going up. So I'm wondering if you have any ways of kind of creating, counteracting that very polarizing story in a different way. Yeah.
Yes, everything was blamed on bail reform. There's more rats in the street in New York City, bail reform. I mean, it's literally, that's how bad it's been. There are also more rats on the street because we cut the sanitation department's budget. So 2 ideas for how do you report in a nuanced, thoughtful way about this. First of all, the stories that aren't told are the thousands and thousands of New Yorkers who've been released, and without incident, they've gone home to their families and their communities as a result of bail reform. Go find those people, in the way that you go find the case that is the sort of outlier, somebody gets rearrested. And mind you, the studies that we have is in New York City, where we have great court data. At any given time, about 0.5% of people who are released pre-trial are rearrested while their case is open in any given month for a new violent felony offense. So it's tiny, tiny, tiny. About 5% of people who are released pre-trial get arrested for anything. The numbers are really low. So as opposed to focusing on the 5%, the rearrest, focus on those 95% that we don't hear about. So sit in court, find those stories, follow those people, tell the stories, again, in a humanizing way. And I think that that will help to change the narrative so that Ms. Harris is not the story about bail reform, so that Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones or Ms., pick a name. That's what people think of when they think of bail reform. The other is pull those statistics that I just quoted. Those are New York City statistics. They're readily available through the Criminal Justice Agency, which is New York City's government pretrial services agency. Tell those stories as opposed to, again, the one outlier case. And I think those are two of the ways in which to tell an accurate and fair story, because you're right, it's not just about the jail population, it's also about public safety, but to tell them in accurate and nuanced and thoughtful ways.
Hi, I'm Joseph with the Arizona Republic. Going back a bit to what we're talking about budgets. So obviously we know that jails take a large amount of county budgets and stuff like that. But when it comes to decarceration, one thing I haven't really been seeing is you talk specifically about New York City. Has there been a really solid number on the amount of money that's been saved? And if so, I guess my biggest question with that is, I just double fact checked myself.
Yeah.
Their budget is still rising.
Yeah.
And there's some argument that it's about pensions, but also there hasn't been any difference of spending. Mm-hmm. So where is the savings coming from if we're still spending the same amount?
Yeah. I love this question because my other love, other than bail and pretrial, is budgets. So we have 3 resources that I think would be helpful that, again, I can share after. One is what policing costs, which is that database that I mentioned of 72 police departments, their budgets. We also did a similar thing on jails and what jails cost, and we looked to see over the past decade, jail populations have declined in this country by 13% overall. It's mostly driven by big city declines in jail population, places like New Jersey, New York, that have done bail reform. But what we have seen is that spending on jail continues to either stay the same or rise, even in places that have cut their jail populations by 50%. And the reason why is close to 90% of a jail budget is personnel. And you all know from covering criminal justice and unions that cutting personnel in a unionized workforce is really difficult. Nobody wants to take on that political fight. And so you have the same number of corrections officers overseeing a jail that is half full or a third full, and there are no cost savings because 90% of the jail budget is personnel, overtime, things that you simply cannot change. You can't cut costs or save. The tiny marginal cost savings are from things like less programming, less food, less things like that. But again, that counts in most jail budgets as less than 10% of the jail budget itself, and so that's why you're not seeing any returns. So there's a number of efforts that are going on across the country to try and right-size the jail budget and personnel to actually be commensurate with decarceration. We haven't seen it work yet. Literally, I can't think of a single place that has done so, except for having to do layoffs because the county is overall in a deficit, but not explicitly tied to decarceration and trying to get cost savings there. And in a moment where defund the police is the most sort of polarizing phrase, anything that smells to politicians or elected officials of defunding, whether that's jails, let alone police, just doesn't seem viable in this moment. So again, in terms of reporting, I think there's great reporting to be done on decarceration, public safety, police and jail and prosecutor budgets, just to start getting out there, because I think the average person would be horrified by how much we are spending on the local jail or on the local police department as opposed to on housing or pretrial services or community-based mental health or medical care, the things that actually help to deliver public safety. So I think that's the way to tell that story and start to get that out there. through reporting and numbers.
Hi, thank you. Akayla Lacey with The Intercept. You talked a lot about media coverage driving public opinion, and you touched briefly on specific public perceptions of crime polls. I'm anticipating that we're going to be seeing a lot of that ahead of the midterms. And I'm wondering, I mean, I see these a lot sort of written up as news by media outlets, like, you know, without sort of acknowledging all of the role that all of us play in that. And I was wondering if you could just speak more to that and sort of like, you know, you gave a lot of suggestions on how to sort of counteract this in our own individual stories, but just sort of in our own newsrooms, like how to sort of deal with that when it comes up, or respond to sort of like pushing that as indicative of something. Yeah.
Yeah. Such a great question, because public polling is really expensive. I mean, I work for a large criminal justice organization. We do some polling. It's unbelievably expensive to field a poll, as you all probably know. And so the poll that I was referencing, that didn't make it into my slideshow, but I'll put it in and send it around to you all, was a Siena College poll, and Siena does a lot of public opinion polling in New York. And if you look closely at that poll, they basically asked, do you support bail reform, yes or no? Not a nuanced question, right? And so what is bail reform is up to, you know, it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And asking that same question back when the stories and the narrative in the media is Khalif Browder, who couldn't get out and, you know, spent 3 years in jail until his case was dismissed because his family couldn't afford $3,000 bail, compared to Ms. Tiffany Harris, who just keeps getting released. Like, that informs how public opinion and voters respond to, do you support bail reform? The way to counter that is there are organizations like Vera, like Forward US, like the ACLU, others, Pew, who are doing much more nuanced polling. And so as opposed to, do you support bail reform, questions that actually break it down. You know, should money determine whether you are released pre-trial? Is incarceration the only way to deliver public safety? Would you support more community-based mental health care for people experiencing mental illness that is driving their justice system involvement? Those are all questions that we've seen polled, and across the board, independent, Democrat, Republican, people are favorable to these kinds of reforms. It really depends on how the question is asked. And so my recommendation is to find the polling that asks those nuanced questions. They will give you very different results than the Siena College, do you support bail reform or not? And that's the story to tell. It's a harder story to tell because it's not quite so like neat and tidy and simple, but that will actually help to bring some nuance into this and to talk about, well, we can't just do bail reform. We actually need to build up the community-based services and supports that actually support people who are released pre-trial. That's what it helps to deliver. And going back to the budget question, it's those kinds of public polls that help to build support among elected officials to say, let's build out good pre-trial services. Let's invest in more, you know, housing for people who are justice involved. All of the things that we know actually help make people sort of, you know, stay safe and be successful when they're released.
I know the woman actually who was part of the group that was attacked, and she came out to the press not wanting conviction or punishment for the issue, and that got very little coverage. And so just a comment that I think in media we assume the victim wants punishment, which is not often the case, and it's not often explored in the stories we tell.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's such a thoughtful, good point, Emily. And the New York Post coverage of the victim who was harmed by Ms. Harris and said, I do not want to see her prosecuted. I do not want to see her in jail. The New York Post story about her was almost ridiculous, sort of made it seem like she really, this is absurd that she doesn't want to move forward with this prosecution. So there's, again, a lot to be said for thoughtful reporting, not assuming, and digging under, right, to ask what's behind this and to report in a fair and nuanced way. That's exactly right. So thank you so much. What a great group. It feels like such a privilege really to get to talk with you all. My contact information is at the end of the PowerPoint that, again, we'll make sure gets to you. Please reach out at any time. Thanks so much for all you're doing. Enjoy the next couple of days.